on the day it was delivered. Conservatives believe in clean air, low taxes, and a healthy economy. A clean environment and well-paying jobs are only possible when taxpayers are treated with respect. This is in marked contrast to the Liberal governments who stifle competitiveness and investment with their out-of-control deficit policies. In Ontario, we have suffered rising small business and personal taxes, a higher minimum wage that was introduced with no thought of its negative impacts, like job losses and soaring electricity rates. The additional environmental laws and regulations brought on by this government are driven by ideology rather than common sense, including the new carbon tax that will do nothing to help the environment and will make Canada a bad place to invest. Of course, entrepreneurs already figured this out years ago when they moved their capital out of Canada after the last election. Carbon taxes raise the cost of doing business, a cost that will be shouldered on the backs of ordinary Canadians. Thoughtful Canadians who follow my speeches in Parliament will recall when I first sounded the alarm shortly after the 2015 election, where the finances of our nation were headed. Since the 2015 election, there has been an unprecedented flight of capital from Canada. After October 19, 2015, over $122 billion fled the country. For the first time, according to Statistics Canada, total Canadian investment in the United States exceeds that of United States holdings in Canada. Scared investors fled the country. Capital that should have been available for the private sector to create jobs in Canada instead was used to create jobs in Trump's America. Make no doubt about it. This government has been getting a free ride on the American recovery. As demonstrated by the announcement of more job losses in the automotive manufacturing sector, the free ride is over. Between Canadian investment dollars and cheap oil, the Prime Minister has been Donald Trump's best friend to the harm of working Canadians. In their first 5 months of office, the Liberals spent the Conservative budget surplus and burned through billions more. Then they proceeded to fake news their way through their bad spending and changing accounting methods to try to cover up the Conservative budget surplus. Ontario taxpayers have seen this cover-up before, when the disgraced former Ontario Premier Kathleen Wynne tried to cover up how much the Toronto Liberal Party had driven Ontario into debt with her bad spending and making election bribes promises taxpayers could not afford. This economic statement is costly and dogmatic, with no plan to balance the budget, the finances of Canada, anytime in the future. Only a Liberal government would brag about taxes fattening coffers. And what did this finance minister do with the tax windfall the government collected from average working middle-class Canadians? He spent it. Rather than slowing the growth of the federal deficit in a budget that will never be balanced as long as the member for Toronto Centre is the finance minister, he spent the additional tax revenues and more on bad spending. This government wasted taxpayers' dollars on things like a $500,000 logo, $40,000 on propaganda Facebook ads aimed at telling children how to use a stove. Let's not forget the $65 million that was spent on big greenhouse gas-producing SUVs to impress G7 members as part of the Prime Minister's Vanity project to buy a seat on the UN Security Council. The Liberals broke their election promise in raising taxes on small business. By selectively raiding the employment insurance account, payroll taxes are set to rise along with the changes to CPP the government has legislated to start next year. These additional costs are layered on top of the rise in minimum wage. Our party left government with a $3.2 billion surplus and had the best job creation record among the G7 countries. As a result, we were able to keep taxes low for Canadian families and businesses. We reduced the taxes to their lowest point in 50 years, with a typical family of four saving almost $7,000 a year. Energy poverty is now a fact of life in my riding of Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke. This economic statement does nothing to help people in need. Luckily, smart voters elected Doug Ford to put a stop to corrupt electricity practices of the previous provincial party.
Common sense.
The good he was trying to do is being undermined by this deficit-obsessed Liberal Party. The economic statement makes energy poverty worse for all Canadians, with more money for industrial wind turbines. Unlike before, in only Ontario, now every time one is put up, everyone's taxes go up. In Ontario, the price of electricity to consumers rose to the highest level in North America. This federal government action just picks a different taxpayer's pocket with the same failed policies that resulted in Ontario as being the most indebted sub-national government in the world. So what is the policy of this government that's driving the deficit so high and costing more job losses in the automotive manufacturing sector? The policy of the Liberal government is to intentionally wind down Canada's fossil fuel industry, and with the most recent announcement from General Motors, the products that use the fuels as well. The Prime Minister clearly stated in January 2017, quote, we need to manage the transition off our dependence on fossil fuels, end of quote. I quote the Calgary Herald. That's what the Liberals have been doing since being elected in 2015. They're managing down Alberta's industry by imposing new regulations, killing pipeline options, withdrawing tax incentives, and passing energy-hostile bills, such as C-48 and C-69. The crash in prices for Alberta and bitumen is a direct result of Liberal hostility to both the Northern Gateway and the Energy East pipelines. The damage to Ottawa's finances will be huge, but that seems slow to sink in. Maybe that's because for many government MPs and ministers, the crisis looks like a kind of victory, end of quote. Now, the Liberal Party can claim another victory with the announcement that thousands will lose their jobs at the General Motors factory in Ontario. So while the policy to kill the Alberta economy is working, maybe a bit too well, it remains to be seen how the federal government will react in this policy to shut down the fossil fuel industry as it's being felt across the country with more job losses, particularly in the automotive manufacturing sector, which is centred in central Canada. The policy to shut down the oil and gas industry can only be followed by shutting down the industries that need fossil fuel to operate. So I'm waiting for the proper mainstream media reporting on this story. As the rising deficit and more of this government's disastrous policies work their way into Canada's economy, the only response by this government can be labelled as a threat to democracy in Canada. Rather than changing direction, the response by Principal Secretary Gerald Butts and the rest of the Prime Minister's handlers is to double down with a propaganda campaign and an audacious plan to bribe the Canadian media in how facts are either reported or selectively omitted. When a Conservative MP utters the words fake news, it launches headlines in the Globe and Mail, Global News, and the Ottawa Citizen. When the member for Ottawa Centre calls a columnist she doesn't like fake news or attacks a climate scientist or another member of Parliament, the response by too many members of the captive media is silence or some form of fake news. How many more independent voices in the media will be silenced with this bribe that's being offered? And how about the timing? In an election year, democracy depends on an independent media. The so-called arm's-length panel that will act like a government censor board to determine who gets direct funding is a model ripe for abuse. Censor boards will censor. That's what they're intended to do. The Liberals have stolen the media's power to set the federal election debates, and now they're turning the media into a political wedge issue on what gets reported. The voters in my riding know a bribe when they see it, and they know when a political party is trying to stack the deck in its own favor. All of this bad spending is being done with borrowed money.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. The problem with asking a question here is there's so many things, so much inaccurate information that's there. Where does one begin? really is the first thing that comes to my mind, Madam Speaker. You know, every year there's about over 200,000 people that die in Canada. I'm surprised she didn't blame that on the government of Canada, Madam Speaker. You know, at the end of the day, I guess maybe to focus the member on a specific question, can she explain to the House how many or why it is that the Conservatives who have been in power for 38% of the time, 38% of the time in Canada's 151 years, they have accumulated 75% of the debt. So they're very good at debt accumulation. When I asked the member prior to this, the Conservative member said, well, blame the Liberals. So I'm not, just in case she's thinking of blaming the Liberals, let me just remind her that Stephen Harper inherited a multi-billion-dollar surplus, and before the recession even got underway, converted it into a multi-billion-dollar deficit. I'm wondering if she can just kind of explain to Canadians why they should believe that the Conservatives know anything about deficit management.
The honourable member for Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke.
Mr. Speaker, once again, I thank my most loyal fan across the way for asking the first question today. And I want to remind everyone of the Flaherty principle, which really does work. Flaherty's principle was that as you reduce taxes, overall revenues actually increase. Hear, hear. And that's why when we were government, we were able to lower taxes and grow jobs in the economy at the same time. In fact, we saved the average family of four $7,000, the lowest tax rate in over 50 years. And let us not forget what's happened just this week. It's not just the oil sands the government is shutting down. Now it's shutting down all the industries, or beginning to shut down, and we're seeing it at GM, beginning to shut down the industries that are related and use fossil fuels. So this is only going to compound the problem, and the debt that they're racking up is going to cost even more.
Hear, hear. Questions and comments. The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for her speech. I think all parliamentarians were quite shocked when they saw the Sears retirees and employees after Sears shut down lose significant amounts of their pension. And I know one of the deficiencies in the bill before the House, and something the government chose not to act on, was to amend the Bankruptcy Act and other similar legislation to ensure that workers' pensions were protected upon bankruptcy. Does my honourable colleague agree that workers who defer their salaries and wages and put them into company pension plans should have that money protected from creditors in the event of a bankruptcy, or is she content with the status quo?
The honourable member for Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke.
Like the member who just spoke, we in our community have many people who have who were already retired and collecting pensions from Sears, and we also endured many people who suffered as a consequence of Nortel. With the Sears specifically, and with the different automotive companies that have huge debts, and what it's led from is the provincial holiday that they've given these companies. So the most important measure that has to be taken, firstly, is for the non-federally regulated pensions to be required to make sure there was always more than enough funding in the pension pool.
Time just for one more short question and response. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
I've heard my honourable colleague mention several times through her address that reducing fossil fuels was somehow put forward as a bad thing. I just wonder if her view is that we should increase production of fossil fuels or eliminate them so that we have some chance of survival on this planet.
The honourable member for Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke.
Mr. Speaker, as the fossil fuel industry in Canada is wound down and more fossil fuels are taken out of the ground in countries outside of Canada, in places where they don't have the environmental laws that we do, the emissions are actually increasing. So as a total result, of shutting down our oil sands, what we're getting is more emissions overall in other countries because they don't sequestrate the carbon or let alone pay attention to the overall emissions rules.
Resuming debate. Reprise de débat. La députée de Vimy.
Monsieur le Président, il me fait grand plaisir de prendre la parole aujourd'hui pour parler du projet de loi C-86. En tant que député de la circonscription de Vimy et membre du